Hi ladies, I have a lot to talk about in this week's video. So I do want to just talk about some of the homework stuff first. First of all, I enjoyed reading your discussions this week, and I know many of you talked about the challenge of trying to interpret the Bible and, to try to answer whether something was prescriptive or descriptive, or to see comparisons and differences between the Gospels. And that is very challenging work, and I was proud of how you handled that. And I know one of the posts talked about, if something happened in the cafeteria at College of St. Mary and you were all witnesses to it, you would all report on it a little differently, and how people might read your reports might be a little different. And that's so true of the Bible too. And it really does take a lot of understanding of the context and the people who wrote these stories and how the stories were kind of preserved to really fully understand what they might be saying. So thank you for your efforts with that. Second of all, the next paper that you're going to write is going to be due on July 9th. And this paper is just a reaction paper, but first you need to watch a movie. And so in the syllabus, you'll find a list of movies. I think all of these movies can be found at College of St. Mary's Library. So please watch one of them in the next couple weeks, and you need to write a 2 to 3 page reaction paper. Because this paper is a reaction paper, it's more informal. You can use personal pronouns. I do want to know what your personal opinion is on the women and their story and how they influence you. And if you look at the end of the syllabus, you'll see some questions to try to answer in that paper. Again, it only has to be 2 to 3 pages. You don't have to use outside sources, but if you do, then you should cite them and have a works cited page. Also, you'll take your first test at the end of this week, and that test will be just like the ones you've been taking, except twice as many questions and twice as much time, and the questions will be over everything that you've studied so far. So make sure you look over all the notes first before you start. So now we're going to start talking about the book or the reading for this week. So you're starting a new book. The book is called Her Story, and this book is by Barbara McAfee, and this book's format is kind of unique. So first of all, in each chapter, it will give you a backdrop, sort of like a general idea of the kind of situation for women at the time. It will also talk about some specific women and examples, and then it will include a section that are primary source readings, so actual writings from that time period. And I do want you to read those too. Chapter 1 will feel a little bit like review information. It does go over a lot of what you read about in Bonnie Thurston's book. So first of all, in the Gospels, it kind of gives the summarization anyway, that Jesus himself wasn't very clear about the role of women, although he was very countercultural, and there definitely were women that were followers that were part of the early church. With Paul's letters, it also pointed out, as the book, Bonnie Thurston's book did, that Paul can be a little contradictory, meaning in one letter he might say one thing, in another letter he might say something completely different. And of course, just based on the type of letter, genuine letter or pseudonymous letter, captivity letter, that could explain some of the differences. And plus, we always have to remember that we don't know the historical context, and we don't know what he was writing in response to, okay? And we always have to remember when we're talking about scripture that it was written by men, for men, about men. And so, the roles of women are kind of spare or, sparse, but the fact that they're mentioned and that they're mentioned by name is important. So the new book will cover some of those stories that you've already read about. It does kind of talk about some of the different kind of heretical groups at the time. Heresy is kind of a lie against the church. One of those groups is Gnosticism. Just a little bit about Gnosticism. They basically believed that a spirit connected with God created the earth, kind of cast it off because it was imperfect. That God, when he became aware of this earth, tried to send a spirit down who inhabited Jesus, and that spirit's purpose was to pass on this secret knowledge. And that's what gnosis means, or Gnosticism is based on this word gnosis. And so this spirit kind of pulled people aside and told them this secret information, and then left the body of Jesus before the crucifixion. Okay? So the Gnostics don't really believe in a virgin birth, and that when this human was born, that's when the spirit took over. Before the human died, that's when the spirit left. It is possible within Gnosticism that women had a larger role. One person who's given some real emphasis is Mary Magdalene. In your book, it talks about the patristic view of women, and the patristics is referring to the early church fathers, and that would be people who wrote before 750 AD. And their early sort of translations of Bible stories and interpretations are kind of the roots of sexism today. They believed that women were prone to sin, that marriage itself was good, but that sex within marriage was something that could be sinful and could lead people to sin. And that to be a virgin or to be celibate would be kind of the ideal. Chapter 2 talks more about a couple of movements. One of them is monasticism. The monastic movement was people kind of moving away from the crowded society into the desert and to try to be alone. And they would form kind of groups of people who had the same sort of desire to have more silence, to study more, to pray more. And this led to a practice known as asceticism. Asceticism is extreme self-denial. So in the monastic life, a lot of times people would barely eat, barely sleep, spend all their time in prayer. And it was pretty extreme, almost unhealthy. Saint Benedict was a monk who founded a monastery, and his kind of rule for his order was more kind of what they call the middle way. So it was a little bit of doing those things in moderation, and that after Benedict became kind of the practice. But before Benedict, people were extremely strict with their lifestyle. And so in this time period, women were seen as either being the pit or the throne, meaning they're either sinful and flawed and imperfect and, pulling men into their sinful life, or they're a virgin, they're perfect, they're on the throne. Okay? St. Thomas Aquinas was someone who kind of lived in the medieval era, and he believed that women were inferior, that this is proven by them being created second, and that they were not as smart as men, and that they couldn't make good moral decisions. St. Thomas Aquinas is incredibly important to theology, but his view of women wasn't very good. A woman, or a role for a woman that was kind of important because monasteries were so important, was to be the abbess. That was the female who was the head of the monastery. Another thing that was important about monastic life is that women were kind of given a choice, and now they could choose between marriage and monastic life. Also in the Middle Ages, a real devotion to Mary really developed, and this was because people didn't feel as connected to Jesus because he was, fully human, fully divine, and they did feel a real connection to Mary because she was just fully human. And so they really did develop this real devotion to her. And a lot of sort of magical thinking developed around prayers to her and anything that would have been a possession of hers and any place that she may have been herself. Finally, chapter 2 goes into detail about witch hunts. And that started in like the 1400s, but it lasted for 300 years. And as far as the witch hunts go, 3 or 4 out of 5 of the people who were accused of being a witch were women. So 80% of the time, women were the people being accused of this. And the idea was that this person who was a witch was in cahoots with the devil. And probably if it was a woman, was in some sort of sexual relationship with the devil. And they kind of gave up their whole soul for the devil. Of course, this was all in people's imagination, and it was probably true that a woman who was outspoken, who tried to demand that they be treated better, would be considered a witch. Chapter 3 is kind of explaining a little bit about the Reformation, and in the Reformation, this was a time where the church really was shaken up. So it basically started with a Catholic priest named Martin Luther. And Martin Luther saw a lot of problems happening within the church. Several of the issues that he had were, first of all, that there were teachings in the church that weren't rooted in the Bible. Second of all, he believed that people were saying that there were certain actions or things that you needed to do in order to be saved or to get to go to heaven. And he was saying that it was your faith only and it didn't come down to works. And he's reacting to kind of this emphasis in his life on sort of empty works or going through the motions of things. We as Catholics believe that your works do matter, but we're talking about good works and not empty works. So Luther had a list of grievances that he posted on a door of a church in Germany. And because people, prior to this, about 50 years before this, the printing press had been invented, and that led to more and more people being able to read. They suddenly could read all of his grievances, and a lot of people agreed with him. And this started the Protestant Reformation and the Lutheran Church. And so some things that changed for women in this movement, at least within the Protestant churches, were that, first of all, they didn't believe marriage was a sacrament. And so that meant that divorce could be something that was more acceptable. Women could seek divorces more, freely if they weren't being treated well. Also, Luther believed that celibacy was bad, that we were told to be fruitful and multiply, and so priests were allowed to marry. And, this idea of virginity and celibacy being kind of more important than marriage kind of was not as much promoted within the Reformed churches. And so, women started to have a little bit more equal role in their marriages, especially if you were the minister's wife. That was a really important role. And at this time, that equality, which is not really true in the way that we think of equality, but more equality was given to women, and they were seen as important, but they just had a different, half of the family life that they were in charge of, like taking care of the kids, teaching them about the faith, doing all the housework, being submissive to their husbands. But then when it came to the duties around the house and the faith, they kind of had more of an authority. Some of them were given an education, but what they learned about was more about sewing and cooking and things that would make them better in the home. There were a few exceptions where some Reformed churches, in rare circumstances, could see a time where it would be okay for women to preach, and they would kind of blame the Holy Spirit for empowering that woman to do that. And also in the Protestant churches, because marriage was something that was so valued, and celibacy and virginity became sort of their equal, then the role of Mary was really devalued. So within the Protestant churches, they didn't really spend much time or any devotions toward Mary. You'll read about some of the religious orders that developed within the Catholic Church and what's called the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic response to the Reformation, and how that just led some Catholic people to be a little bit more passionate about women being celibate and virgins. So enjoy the reading this week and have a great 4th of July.